Welcome. I'm Andrew Gleason from the Speaking Lions. This is the first in a series of videos on the theme of God and evil, or as it's often known to philosophers and theologians and others, simply the problem of evil. It's going to be part of a wider series of videos which I'm simply going to call Thinking Out Loud. The name is meant to be to some extent self-explanatory. These are thoughts, things I've been thinking about for many years, but they're always a work in progress. They're always, to some extent, uncertain and speculative, though not all of it by any means. But a lot of it is, and a lot of it is me just working through the problems and the issues. And at this stage, I'm just skimming the surface. As we go on, things will become deeper. As I say, this video is just at the beginning. It'll take time to get to the deeper things, but you know, everything that's worthwhile takes patience. This video will be the videos in general are intended to contain something both for those people who might already have some degree of acquaintance with philosophical and theological discussion and literature, but I also want them to have something for the general reader and the interested person. And I certainly want what I want to say to be relevant to them and in a sense answerable to them. What that comes to, I hope, will emerge as the series goes on. So today's video is intended to just introduce the problem largely as it is understood in the academic context. As we go on, we'll be departing from that context to increasing degrees, but it's hard to avoid starting there. So as I say, the notion of thinking out loud is meant to suggest that I'm, as it were, letting you eavesdrop on my thinking as it's happening, and I'm letting you eavesdrop as much on the mistakes and the errors as on anything that might be true or worthwhile. And I hope you'll pick me up in comments and discussion when I do go wrong, or when I miss a path, or in any way miss the mark. So please feel free to do that. There's much that I do not, or that I only barely understand, and I'm learning on this journey by putting my thoughts out here every bit as much as anybody else might be learning. As we go deeper, things become murkier and harder to see where we're going. So I can only hope and pray that I'm searching in a spirit of truthfulness, that I'm not taking many shortcuts, that, as the philosopher Wittgenstein said, that I'm going the bloody hard way, as he put it. Okay, well, let's begin with just putting the problem of evil, describing the problem of evil as it is generally understood in academic and semi-academic contexts. And I'll show you here a quasi-academic formulation of it. Here it is. What philosophers sometimes call an inconsistent triad. We have three propositions here, and they cannot all be true together. So number one is that the world contains evil. Just occurs to me to mention that I'll often do this. This is going to be full of digressions. You're going to have a lot of patience with me. It's just struck me. It's rather different from saying the world is evil. Say the world contains evil. It's an interesting verb. Seems to me quite some difference between saying it contains evil and it is evil. The problem of evil might look very different if we said the world is evil. Anyway, the world contains evil. 2, God exists and is omnipotent and omniscient. And 3, God exists and is perfectly good. There are different ways this could be formulated. Perhaps it could have said that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good as the second proposition. Make the third one simply that God exists. But anyway, it's the different ways it can be formulated that come to the same thing. The basic idea is that these three propositions cannot all be true together. You can derive a contradiction from them. Now, one seems unassailable, though some people have denied it. We won't try and do that here, or explore that here. It seems more likely that one would escape the contradiction by denying 2 or denying 3. But of course, theists, people who believe in God, especially God as defined here, want to maintain that this is not an inconsistent triad, that in fact these three propositions do not yield a contradiction. The contradiction is only apparent, and this depends upon our making background assumptions that can be brought to life and questioned and perhaps rejected. And we'll be looking into some of that. Now, you might be wondering, and later in another video we will wonder, why it is that we're beginning in such an abstract, theoretical, aloof, and bloodless way, posing this rather refined conundrum. Do we really straightforwardly understand concepts like God and knowledge and power as these are attributed to God? Or good or evil, for that matter? Do we really understand them that readily and clearly, so as to be confident that here we have a well-defined problem with lines of inquiry and a set of candidate solutions and moves and counter moves that, though very complicated in their details, are nevertheless conceptually pretty straightforward and well understood, and it's just a matter of persisting with those details till we get an answer? A lot of academic discussion seems to assume that things are pretty much as straightforward in that way, and that there is nothing here to be explored in these concepts. One might ask in particular whether we really do have a serious grasp of evil. Do we really know what we're talking about when we talk about evil? Is the whole concept dubious, as some people have suggested? Or are we as children talking of things we do not understand? Is there a risk in this abstraction, this very, as I say, remote and academic terms, that evil becomes simply a term of art, disconnected from its real meaning in human life. Well, I taught philosophy of religion in an academic context for many years, and I don't know for sure what went on in most other courses, but it seems to me, judging from most of the academic literature, that it was very rare for autobiographical, historical, or literary examples of evil to appear in philosophical discussions or to be required reading for students in classes. So, for example, I'm as guilty as anyone in this respect. I never required my students to read anything from Job, for example. And I doubt if many other academic teachers did either. Yet to have before us striking examples of the phenomenon we are dealing with, to be sure we understand it and hold ourselves answerable to it, might seem to be basic to the inquiry. So in this video, in this series, I will try to do some penance and to make amends for my failures in this regard. And in that respect, I'm building on something that, and the whole series actually builds on something that I began in my book I published a bit over a decade ago. And I'll post a link to that, or to give the details of that in the duberies below. This dissociation of thought from its actual subject matter seems to me almost raised to the status of an axiom in many academic discussions of the problem of evil, especially when they distinguish, as they explicitly do, between what they call the intellectual problem, the problem as I pose it in the inconsistent triad, and as we'll be discussing it for the rest of this video, the intellectual problem, which is their special bailiwick, versus what they variously call the existential problem, the personal problem, the political problem, which is the problem for each individual, and if he is to be helped by anyone else, it's by pastors and psychologists and counselors and friends and things like that. And for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, the academic literature maintains a very sharp separation between these two problems and confines itself to the intellectual problem. Now, I don't want to say that there is no distinction to be made here at all, but in general the distinction is made, in my opinion, far too starkly and crudely. Again, we'll return to this in a future video. The problem of evil in this abstract academic form is not by any means pointless, but in any event, it is now so ingrained that it is hard to avoid as a starting point, even if we do eventually come to question, as we will, to question some of its assumptions. Anyhow, for good or ill, this is where we will begin and proceed today. Now, there's an alternative way. We can take this inconsistent triad and turn it into an argument against the existence of God. And that argument will look like this. Here it is. Premise 1. If the world was created by an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God, then the world would be a perfectly good world, which is a world without evil. However, premise 2, there is evil in the world. Therefore, see conclusion, the world was not created by an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God. Just strikes me now that C does not uh, expressly say that God does not exist, does that follow from C? Yeah, I think so. Because if God did not create the world, some other, well, either the world existed without being created by God, or there must be some other being or entity, some other explanation for how the world came about, which supposes the existence of something else other than God. Either way, God would not be God as understood in this conception that we're dealing with, or indeed on any conception, I wouldn't think. You're sort of posing another fundamental power in the universe that would be of equal stature to God, and that can't be right on any view. So I think we'll have to take it that C does indeed imply that God does not exist. Okay, so that's the argument. The mainstream philosophical literature draws a distinction between two versions of the argument from evil, generally known as the logical version of the argument and the evidential version of the argument. Now, the general idea with the logical version of the argument is that the prosecution case, the case against God, is logically conclusive. Given the existence of evil, or of certain particular facts about evil in other versions, it's simply inescapable that God does not exist. Okay, any possibility of God existing, given the existence of this evil, is just closed off. There's no escape room left for the theist. By contrast with an evidential argument, the case is not conclusive. At best, the existence of God in the light of evil is unlikely, improbable, implausible, or something like that. And there, of course, can be different degrees of that. Perhaps it's just less likely than not, but it is never absolutely certain. It is never completely conclusive. There is always some room for the theist to try and wiggle out of it. So that's the essential difference between those two arguments. In general terms, that's the central idea. The way I express it here is like in terms of the argument that you can see on your screen, is like this. There's a difference in how to understand the premise P1. A logical version of the argument reads P1 as a necessary truth, or perhaps I should say a logically necessary truth. So it's not to confuse it with merely causally necessary or something like that. So if you like, there is a necessity operator, to use some of the jargon of philosophy, at the front of the premise P1. P1 says necessarily, logically necessarily, if the world was created by an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God, then the world would be a perfectly good world, i.e. one without evil, or in certain versions, ones without particular kinds and types of evils. That would be the logical version of the argument, the connection between the existence of God, okay, and a world without evil is one of logical necessity. Now, by contrast with the evidential argument, P1 is not a logical truth, but rather it is a contingent truth that is likely or probable, more likely and probable than not in some degree. So in this case, we would put a probability operator at the front of P1, and P1 would read as something like, probably, if the world was created by an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God, then the world would be a perfectly good world, i.e. one without evil. So, one way, the most important way, the one we're going to be concentrating on, of attacking the argument from evil is to attack P1. I mean, the argument is logically valid, okay? There's no escaping C if you grant P1 and P2. P2 is not a very plausible candidate for being attacked. We noted that when we looked at the inconsistent triad, where one of the inconsistent propositions was the same proposition: there is evil in the world. The obvious line of attack is against P1, and that's where most attacks are made, and that's where the battle is joined. Now, in the case of the logical version of P1, the case where P1 is a logical truth, it will be enough to refute the argument simply to find some scenario in which both God and evil exist, which is a logically possible scenario. A threadbare logical possibility is all you need. That's it. By contrast, it's a much harder ask with the evidential version of the argument. In order to refute the evidential version, the claim that probably if the world was created by God, then there wouldn't be any evil in it. To refute that, you need to come up with a scenario in which it is plausible or likely or probable, okay? You've got to come up with a scenario in which both God and evil exists, where that scenario is not merely logically possible, but is actually feasible, plausible, probable, likely, and so on, in some degree. Well, more so than not. Okay. And that's obviously a much harder ask than coming up with a mere threadbare logical possibility. Now, of course, if you fail in coming up, if the theist fails in coming up with a logically possible scenario, that is, if the logical version of the argument from evil succeeds, then the evidential version is superfluous. We don't need to worry about it. On the other hand, if there is a logically possible scenario, then the matter is not settled at all, but rather, well, the logical version of the argument is defeated, but the atheist just retreats to the evidential version of the argument, and that becomes the focus of debate and discussion. There's a widespread view, especially in the profession, in professional academics, philosophers, that at least since the work of Alvin Plantinga, the logical version of the argument has been conclusively refuted, and consequently a great deal of discussion focuses on the evidential version of the argument. In my view, that's mistaken. I think the logical version is still a live option, but that's a matter to discuss, come up in what I hope will be the next video after this one. And what I'm going to do in the next video after this one is to argue that standard theistic defenses, sometimes also called theodicies, there is a distinction drawn in the literature between defenses and theodicies. I'm not going to worry about it here, might introduce it in a future video. For the moment, I'm just going to talk about, I'm going to use the terms interchangeably. I'm going to argue that the standard theistic defenses to the argument from evil signal profound failures. And I say profound not just in the sense of deeply wrong, but in the sense that they're wrong in philosophically interesting and important ways. And I think this is true regardless of whether it's the logical version of the argument or the evidential version of the argument that is at stake. And so I'm going to be, so my point rather will hold in both contexts. So that means that in effect I am championing both arguments against these standard theistic responses in the academic and in quite a degree too of popular, semi-academic popular literature. But it's important to remember that the failure of these standard defenses does not mean that the argument from evil in either form, logical or evidential, succeeds. That is a further question, again, one to which we will return in future videos. Okay, so we have to concentrate our attention on the premise P1. We need a scenario in which God and evil exist together, or the theist needs such a scenario, and it needs to be, for the logical evil, a bare logical possibility, and for the evidential version of the argument, it needs to be not merely logically possible, but also probable or likely. What on earth would that scenario be? Or as philosophers, to use one of the terms of art used by philosophers, does God have a morally sufficient reason to create a world that contains evil, or sometimes put, to permit his creation to contain evil? There's subtle differences, I think, between all those notions, but for the moment let's treat them as the same. Basically, there are two central ideas, two main ideas They, the variations of them on them are innumerable. We're just going to consider them in very general terms. But there are two basic lines of defence, which I'm going to call respectively the greater goods defence and secondly the free will defence. The basic idea of the greater good defence is that evils which we see in the world God is justified in creating or permitting evils which we see, which exist in the world, because they are the logically, not just causally, but logically indispensable conditions of certain greater goods which justify those evils. So to take the classic example, and perhaps there's the place, perhaps we'll look at it in more detail here. Here we go. Evil goods. So in the world we see such goods, we call them first order goods. This kind of structure was due to the work of an Australian atheist philosopher, John Mackie. He's not responsible for the details here, but he was one of the first to set out this kind of structure. We have goods and evils down here on the this axis, and first, second and third orders across here on the horizontal axis. So first order goods are things like pleasure and happiness. I don't know where things like joy, for example, where they fit into, whether they're first order or higher order in some way, but we'll put all that aside. The discussion tends to deal with some pretty elementary states. Then with evils, we have such things as pain and suffering. Again, where would something like distress, sorrow, is that first or second order? Sorrow, you might think, is a response to certain forms of pain and suffering, and so perhaps belongs to the second order. But anyway, however that may be, let's say pain and suffering. Okay. So there's the problem of evil, of course. These are the evils that the argument from evil against God concentrates on. But the greater goods defence says, hang on a moment, this pain and suffering is a logically necessary condition, not just causally necessary, but logically necessary condition for these second order goods: courage, fortitude, compassion, charity, and others of that ilk. You can't have these goods without these evils. And the fact that you do have these goods justifies God. It gives him a morally sufficient reason to create or permit these evils. But that's not the end of the story, because of course the world with pain and suffering, you don't only get at the second order, you don't only get the goods, you also get second order evils. Some people's responses to pain and suffering and hardship in life are the responses of cowardice, resentment, and cruelty. Okay? Some people go around inflicting pain and suffering on others, and so on. But these, cowardice, resentment, and cruelty, seem to be logically necessary conditions for such third-order goods as forbearance and forgiveness. Okay? And the idea would again be that these justify the existence of the second order goods. A world that has compassion, fortitude, and compassion in it, a world that has forbearance and forgiveness in it, is overall a better world than a world which eliminates pain and suffering but does not have these greater goods in it. Now, of course, there are also third order evils, perhaps, such as vindictiveness. Is there a fourth order good, okay, to justify the vindictiveness? Well, the argument goes on from there. I won't pursue it any further than that because I'm going to cut it all off at a much earlier stage, but I leave that issue for next week. What I've said here is just to give you the general structure of greater goods argument. You have an ascending set or orders of goods and evils, with the evils at one order n being logically necessary condition of goods at the next order n plus 1. And this ascends through who knows how many tiers, how many orders. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now, and that's the first of the two main lines of defence to the logical and to the evidential argument from evil. The second is the free will defence. Now, here my take on the ideas is a little different from that of most discussions. It does seem to me that there is a form of the free will story which is genuinely different from the greater good one, but that in fact most discussions of the greater good defence are actually, so most famously the discussion in someone like Alvin Plantinga, it's actually a version of the greater good defence. It's that version of the greater good defence in which the greater good in question is human free will. Human free will is usually regarded, meaning, again, without wanting to get in too much discuss of the nature of free will. No, look, I'll just leave it at that. We'll just talk about free will. If you're going to have genuine free will, then God cannot make human beings, okay, always do the right thing, okay? If they're genuinely to have free will, then sometimes human beings and perhaps other created beings are going to do evil actions, and bad things will happen. Bad things will happen to good people. But that's the price that has to be paid in order to have the good of free will. Now, this line of thinking is often connected to another one which is sometimes called the soul-making theodicy. This is due to some very famous philosophers of religion such as John Hick. Also in some of his thinking, Richard Swinburne, and at the popular level, this kind of view was very strongly presented by C.S. Lewis in his book, The Problem of Pain. The basic idea here is that human life is a veil of suffering for the purpose of leading human beings into a closer and deeper relationship with God. It's to make them realize, to be as it were a thorn in their side. I think that's an analogy that Lewis actually uses. Or he also uses the analogy of a megaphone. Pain is God's megaphone, okay? Sounding in our bodies to remind us of our dependency on Him and to bring us into a close and loving relationship with Him, which of course we can only enter into freely, hence the free will. That kind of relationship can't be compelled, is the thought. So that's the soul-making theodicy. It has the greater good structure. I won't look for exactly where in the level of orders the greater good comes, but you can see that freedom logically requires, okay, well, at least the possibility of evil occurring. And if it does occur, and it has occurred, okay, then it's such a great good. The free will and the kind of loving relationship that with God, that freedom makes possible, that is such a great good that it justifies the evil which is the cost of that good. Okay. Now it does seem so on that view, okay, although a lot of the literature talks about the greater good defense and the free will defense as if they were sharply separate, they do seems to me really that the emphasis, most of the discussions of free will, certainly Plantinga's, is really is a version of the free will defense. Now I do think that you can have a form of the free will defense which is something quite different from the greater good defense, and the idea behind it is simply this: well, look, who's to blame for all this evil in the world? Okay, well, we are. Okay, we did it, and pain and suffering due to illness and natural disasters and so forth, well, that could be the work of other created beings misabusing their free will, okay, just as we are. That's perfectly possible too. Okay, so God's not to blame, we're to blame. The creatures are to blame, not God. Okay, God's off the hook. No mention there of greater goods. Okay, just that there are different people to blame. Now, where does that argument go? I'm not going to say anything more about it here. Okay, I'll come back to it later on. Just to familiarize you with terms which you'll find popping up, if you go on to read anything in The Problem of Evil, any of the literature I suggest, which I'll put in the notes below. You need to be familiar with the distinction between natural evil or physical evil, as it's sometimes called, on the one hand, and moral evil on the other. So, moral evil is those wicked, evil actions freely performed by human beings. So lying, cheating, stealing, murder, and so on, fraud, and so on. Cruelty, etc. Natural evil is any kind of suffering, pain, perhaps other kinds of psychic states which can be the result both of natural phenomena such as illness, natural disasters, bodily injury and so forth, or perhaps sometimes the result of other human actions, okay, but which are not, as it were, freely chosen by the agent. There are things that the agent suffers rather than something the agent does, so typically pain and suffering in general. Okay, this has just been to try and give you some idea of the problem of evil as it arises in typical academic discussion, at least in English-speaking analytic philosophy. I think there are a lot of problems with not just proposed solutions and so forth, but with a lot of assumptions and with the whole way and indeed the whole tone in which the discussion goes on, and I intend to explore this for, well, at least as far as I'm able to do. So I hope to put out another video soon in which I'm going to present my central objection to the greater good form of defense, which seems to me just wrong. But that's going to lead us into some deeper issues. Okay, I hope this has been intelligible. I've got some links in the notes below to some relatively elementary, I hope, literature if you're interested in pursuing it. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. Feel free to make comments below. In particular, if you found something difficult or obscure, I always try and put out another video and try and or maybe put something in the comments to try and make things clearer and so forth. So okay, be good to one another, pursue the greater good, and we can do that. You can do that by hitting that like button and the subscribe, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks very much. Okay, cheers.